Leaders of 15 Asia-Pacific nations have agreed to terms on the world's largest trade deal. The leaders pressed ahead with the pact, even though India refused to join. Even without India, the deal still covers about 29% of the global economy. Dr. Jeffrey Wilson is Research Director at the Perth US Asia Centre, and he joins me now from Perth. And what is the main points for Australia from this pact?
Well, what we've seen is there's actually already over 100 bilateral free trade agreements between different countries in Asia, including Australia. We've got about a dozen of these. But what this RCEP trade agreement tries to do is actually bring these together and put them into a single set of regulatory standards. One of the problems with all the individual agreements is they have different rules and numbers and tariffs and regulations, and so businesses actually have a very hard time actually using them to do trade and investment. And so by bringing everything together into a single system, the hope of this agreement is it's going to be an integrator that actually unlocks some of the trade agreements that we've already made. And
do we know which Australian industries are likely to be the bigger winners of this pact?
A lot of Australia's free trade agreements in the past have been bilateral ones with just one country, like the Indonesia Free Trade Agreement we very recently signed. And usually in those you see particular industries that have major gains. It would be beef or wheat or the mining industry or something. But because this agreement is effectively about taking an existing system and bringing it together in a more cohesive way, you don't have that headline industry A or B will be able to benefit significantly here because it's not opening new markets. And what we will see, though, is any Australian business that's engaged with the Asian region at all should see better advantages in terms of streamlined trade processes, more efficiencies and lower costs. So this is really something where there's a big benefit, but it's spread evenly throughout all of the exporting sectors of the economy.
How big an issue is it for us here in Australia that India hasn't signed on it, at least as yet?
It's certainly a disappointment for Australia and indeed everyone. India's involvement in this agreement would have been the first time Australia and India had a trade agreement of any kind, and it would have also been a big political signal about building political relationships. However, we need to remember that there had been, for almost the entire time of this trade agreement's negotiation, a big stalemate between China and India over how the two of them would trade inside this 16-party bloc. And things have really been deadlocked for the last 2 to 3 years while those two countries work that out. So while it's disappointing that India's removed themselves, this is going to at least make clear the way for the other 15 countries to be able to go on and complete this really important integrating trade agreement.
Now, we can't read the text of this agreement. Why is that, and is that a problem?
The really simple reason today is the text isn't available yet. With India just withdrawing, there would be a lot of parts of the text that would refer to things that India needs or India's trade with the other 15 members. That now has to all be reviewed, those sections taken out, and it might have forced changes in other parts of it. So the governments have said we should expect to see a text in the early in the new year. A broader point about this is all international treaties, whether trade or arms control or environmental protection, are negotiated in camera between governments. That's the nature of treaty negotiation processes. So it's completely unsurprising that a trade agreement remains closed until the final text is agreed, because this is true of every international treaty that's ever existed.
And this is a trade pact, of course, but to what extent is it just about trade?
From India's point of view, their official statement is that they're unhappy with the trade solution that they were able to negotiate with China, and therefore that they didn't think it was in their national interest. But it would be fairly clear to most observers that there's also a shadow of geopolitics in this, particularly the nature of China-India relations. They had a border dispute a few years ago, some security rivalries, particularly in the maritime domain, and great power rivalry in Asia is certainly casting a shadow over that. With the Indian government struggling to see whether this was an economically good deal for them, some of those strategic tensions with China probably helped push the calculus over to it being better to withdraw in the short term.
And how do these trade pacts reinforce diplomatic relations and defence?
Usually when you do a bilateral free trade agreement, say Australia and Indonesia recently, there's a very strong political side to that as well. It's partly about trade, but it's partly about investment and also a whole heap of cooperation across a wide range of areas like cybersecurity, digital platforms, etc., etc. The RCEP is probably strange in that because it's a multilateral agreement, it's less political in that nature. Australia isn't negotiating a new trade agreement with anyone we haven't got one with in the past, but really trying to even out some of the differences in what's going on in the region. So the political significance of this trade agreement is probably less pronounced than a lot of people would be used to in other agreements Australia signed in the last 10 years.
And can these trade pacts actually turn dangerous and really anti-trade?
What we've seen in the last few years is a number of anti-trade populists, Donald Trump, Brexit, people making arguments that trade agreements are extremely dangerous for countries or societies or democracies. And there's a lot of fake news about trade agreements as well. I've heard at one point that the RCEP trade agreement was going to force Australia to reform or get rid of the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. This completely isn't true. But there's certainly a lot of negative sentiment caused by our capitalisation on community fears around trade agreements in these things. RCEP's probably not going to be subject to that because it effectively takes that which we already have and tries to bring it together and integrate it on a single footing. So will be practically no changes for Australia in terms of the regulatory rules or governance or laws or trade settings that we've currently got in Australia at the moment.
Dr. Jeffrey Wilson, Research Director at the Perth US Asia Centre, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.